maybe there's an implicit one. And often when this problem is posed, there's a couple of underlying assumptions, which is that, one, if God is all-powerful, then he could create any world that he wants. And two, if he's all-loving, then he would not allow suffering. And I think David Hume sums it up pretty well. He says, is he willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is benevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then why is there evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why not God? And so as we look at this, then if we look at the flow of it, then yeah, there seems to be a problem, because if all these things are true, if God is all powerful, he can create any world that he wants, then why does he just create a world that doesn't have suffering? And yet there is suffering. And so as we look at this, I think one thing to keep in mind is, are these assumptions necessarily true? And we're going to look at that. So the first one is that if God is all powerful, then he can create any world that he wants. And when we usually think about God and power, what we usually think about it is that he's able to do anything that he wants to do. But I don't think that's necessarily true, because you can't do the logically impossible. And what I mean by that is that you can't make a married bachelor or a round square, right? Because those just don't exist. And so it's an issue not of power, but of possibility. So, for example, if I set a goal for myself, I'm going to get 100% on all my exams in grad school, right? Like, that's already impossible, because, I didn't do so hot. I tested it. But say everything at the beginning of the year, right? And it's theoretically it's possible, but practically it would be pretty much impossible, because I don't have the time to do that. I don't think I'm smart enough to do that. And so it's not an issue of power, because God, he can do that. He's like, yeah, I own this stuff. I created this stuff. I know this. So for him, yeah, it's not a problem. But then no matter how much power I have, no matter how much power God has, he still can't make a round square, because it just can't logically exist. And in the same way, God can't make someone freely choose to do something. In other words, if God gave us free will, then we have the ability to choose good and to choose evil. So we might ask, so why does he give us free will? And C.S. Lewis puts it this way. He says, free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. So in other words, God is not interested in making a world full of robots where everyone is forced to kind of program to choose him. Instead, he prefers to have someone who freely chooses him. And that also means he runs the risk of being rejected. And many do. But nevertheless, the devotion of someone that can't otherwise choose is not something that's worth having. And so therefore, it's not necessarily true that God can guarantee a world where there's free will with no suffering. And so the second statement is God is all-loving. And if God is all-loving, then he would not allow suffering. And so, what's our understanding of love? I think a lot of times we kind of associate love with like warm and fuzzy feelings, stuff of Hollywood, right? But then in reality, as we look at our own life and relationships within it, love doesn't mean to guarantee a pain-free relationship. If you have two couples who disagree with one another, the right thing to do is to work it out, sort it through. And that could be, uncomfortable. But at the same time, research shows, they did a research at University of Michigan, I think, couples who are willing to work through it are a lot happier than the ones who kind of just suppress all that anger and stuff like that as well. And same way for friendship, right? If your roommate is bothering you, you don't kind of just ignore each other, because then slowly that relationship starts to break down. And from a biological standpoint, pain actually alerts us of physical danger. Case in point, if you put your hand on the stove, man, it's gonna hurt, but you'd rather keep that hand, right? So, and I'm not saying that God actually wants us to suffer or wishes suffering upon us, but just kind of logically speaking, maybe it is possible that God may have sufficient reasons to allow suffering. So let's look at the argument again, right? So we talked about how God, even though he's all powerful, it doesn't mean he can do whatever he wants. And if he's all loving, he might still have good reasons to allow for suffering. And so as we look at those two, And we're back to the original problem, and it seems like, hey, maybe the existence of God is compatible with evil and suffering. And tonight I'm not gonna make a case in terms of why I think God does exist. I'm just saying that they're compatible. And so the argument against God, it actually kind of breaks down. So we'll take a quick break. Just get a chance for you guys to process things, and then if you haven't already done so, go ahead and just meet the people around you. And we'll continue in 5 minutes. But I am going to try my best to give a satisfying answer. And so the voice again, it's I can't trust a God who would forbid suffering. And it's a statement that's backed by all the emotional force of someone who got betrayed by a friend or just had terrible things happen to them. And this person is basically asking, God, why did you allow that to happen? And it's something that really it's a cry for justice, but as well as it challenges the character of God. Again, it's someone who says, I don't know if God is there, but if He is, why does He seem so distant and so loose, or maybe even wicked? And it's a serious challenge. We look at the people throughout history, this is what they've said. No one can believe in a good God if they sat at the bedside of a dying child. Richard Russell. And Bar Ehrman, former Christian, says, the problem of suffering became for me the problem of faith. After many years of grappling with the problem, trying to explain it, thinking through the explanations that others have offered, I finally admitted defeat. I could no longer believe in a God of my tradition. And even a pastor acknowledges too. The fact of suffering undoubtedly constitutes the single greatest challenge to the Christian faith. Sensitive spirits ask if it can possibly reconcile with God's justice and love. And I agree with John. The problem of suffering poses a serious challenge to the Christian faith. Because for Christians, we're not simply interested in telling people that God is there, but we also want people to know that He's loving and He actually cares about people. So before we go into it, let's actually take a step back, because isn't it also true that this problem is a problem that every single worldview and every single person has to make sense of? And so before we look at the Christian response, I wanted to kind of throw out just some of the other alternatives. These are things that I have personally researched or talked to friends, and I think it's generally true. If you find it not true, definitely talk to me later on. But for Buddhism, the first noble truth is to live is to suffer. In other words, as long as we're alive, we have desires, and these desires lend themselves to suffering. And Hinduism believes that suffering is a result of misdeeds, whether in the present or previous life. It's the idea of karma. And Islam belief would say that suffering is a result of unbelief or a form of testing. And then there's atheism. Atheists, one of the biggest objections to Christianity is that the idea of suffering. And yet atheism itself finds it. I think it has a hard time explaining suffering too, because suffering is simply the result of vicious competition, survival of the fittest. And Richard Dawkins says, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, and other people are going to get lucky. You won't find any rhyme or reason to it, or any justice. And so, just keep these things in mind, because they're sort of the point of reference, the context through which we need to think about the Christian view. And I kind of broke it down into 3 sections: the cause of suffering, the role of suffering, and the solution to suffering. So in terms of the cause of suffering, Christians believe that humanity, in nature is rebelling against God. And having rejected God, we live in a fallen world filled with fallen people. And what that means is that there's the reality of human evil. And I think this is actually the section that accounts for most of the suffering that we see in the world. God really gave us the free choice, and He can't be afraid for us to act on it and to let things, play out. If I really wanted to punch someone, He can't change the trajectory and then make me say, "Man, I'm really glad to have you." I got to actually wind up and follow through. And so, for us, that means true freedom is to allow the choices to play out. And God, who gave us free will, made evil possible. But unfortunately, people with that free will is what made evil reality. And then there's natural evil. And this is something that's always hard to explain, because it's hard to find someone that's accountable for it. And yet part of it has to do that, we do live in a fallen world. I don't think it's part of God's original plan to have disease and illness within it. Um, and then another part of it is that, it's also a consequence of the laws of nature. That, for example, to gravity, the same force that holds the Earth together and that puts us in orbit, it's also the same force that's gonna, like if you trip accidentally, it's gonna hurt because it's gonna drag you down. And so yeah, suffering kind of exists because God allows these choices and the natural order of things to run its course. And yet, suffering is not an end to itself because Christianity believes that the main purpose of life is not to maximize pleasure and comfort, but to restore that broken relationship, to come to know God. And there's actually cases in which God is able to redeem the existing suffering to work towards His purpose. And again, it's not like God wants us to suffer, but sometimes the experience of suffering actually brings people closer to God. And I don't want us to be like mechanical about this. Don't think of it as like like God is saying, okay, give this guy a little bit of good things, a little bit of bad things, and a lot of suffering, and boom, you get a Christian. It doesn't work like that. Again, it's about God letting the consequences play out, and as He sees suffering, He actually sends His response, a personal response to that situation. Whether it's bringing a friend or a person into that situation, or some other circumstances. And this is actually a pattern that we see throughout history. Think about the example of the early church. Its beginnings included the death of its leader and scattering of its original members. And yet, shortly after, the movement started to spread like wildfire. It was a movement that didn't have any finances, no proven leadership, no evangelism training, didn't exist back then. And yet, within 300, and then during the same time, Emperor Nero persecuted the church because he saw the Christians as a threat to the Roman Empire. And yet, in less than 300 years, it became the dominant religion of the West. And a more modern example is actually China. During the Cultural Revolution, 20 million Chinese people believed to have died under Chairman Mao. And during this time, the church experienced perhaps the most difficult persecutions I've ever experienced. And yet, by 1990, there were estimated to be 30 to 75 million Christians in China. And the reason why there's such a big range is because actually a lot of Christians, they went underground to deal with the persecution. And it's actually a pattern that I found to be true of my own. So actually my journey of faith started in the midst of tragedy as well. I still remember coming home one day and my parents telling me that my brother, he went to the hospital. Apparently he had a high fever, which led to multiple seizures. And so the next time I saw him, he was actually in a coma. And he had the intubation tube and the IV line sustaining him. It was the only thing that the doctor could do because they didn't really know why the seizures were there. But the coma actually helped with that. It prevented it from happening. But then, I remember visiting him often, hoping that he would recover. But within the month, he passed away. And I don't know, like in high school, how are you supposed to make sense of that? And for me, it opened a lot of questions that I couldn't answer. And that's actually during this time that I started going to church, and a friend invited me. And I went in not expecting that religion is actually going to remedy the situation or anything. But at the same time, I didn't have much to lose. So when I went, actually, I kind of gave it a fair hearing, and I found that the Bible actually has a lot to say about life. And for me, it came to a point where I saw a very clear fork in the road. If I were to remain atheist, then I would have to accept the bleak reality of it. But then if I were to become Christian, then I have to change my life and follow God's ways. So either way, it was a hard choice. It wasn't a good place to be in, but I took that seriously, and I started talking to different people. I talked to Christians, the pastor at the church, as well as atheist friends to get a different perspective. And for me, when at the end, when the intellectual questions were answered, I felt like I had sufficient reason, and I decided to become Christian in my junior year in high school. And after we became Christian, it's not like I grieved any less. The pain was still there, but at least I was comforted to know that I wasn't alone in that. And as I look back, I'm sure God didn't want our family and want me to suffer like that. But in the midst of this pain, it was a wake-up call for me to think about life. And God gives us opportunity to bring me closer to Him. And C.S. Lewis, he puts it this way: God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. I mentioned earlier that physical pain actually alerts us of danger. Well, maybe the existential anguish that we experience, it tells us something else. Maybe it tells us that there's something wrong with the world, something wrong with us, and sort of a wake-up call for us to think about it. And maybe some of you here today, have experienced that deep sense of pain, and you're already searching for answers. And I don't know exactly what you're going through, but I've been through that, and I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room who've been through that as well. So don't give up, and you're not alone in this suffering. And ultimately, I believe that that God identifies with our suffering. During Jesus' life, he went place to place, healing the blind, the crippled, the lepers, touching the lives of those who were in pain. His teachings turned that society upside down. He said, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. His heart was for the downtrodden and the helpless. And he calls out to the suffering world. He says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest." And yet, ultimately, what he did in his life was only a foreshadow of what he would do in death. The Christian message is that Jesus suffered and died on the cross to redeem us. Death by crucifixion was one of the most painful methods of execution back in the day, and it probably still is, because the victim literally they go in and out of consciousness, out of pain, until they suffocate by their own body weight. And then you think about that picture, why did Jesus, an innocent man who did so much good, why did he have to suffer like that? What in the world was the Son of God doing nailed to a cross? And the central message of Christianity is that God did not abandon us in the suffering. He came to us on a rescue mission. And I'm sure you guys know this verse. For God so loved the world that he gave his own Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. But what does that really mean? I think it's a verse that's kind of hard to understand unless you realize what he did on the cross. And the Bible explains it this way. It says, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we're healed. See, Christians believe that through the cross, God was able to address the fundamental problem of suffering, which is human sin. And having restored that relationship, we have a hope of a new future. So again, to be Christian, it doesn't mean that you're not going to suffer, but you do have a promise from God that one day he will take away all the suffering. And this is what it says in Revelations. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. So God's basically saying, if you trust me, the things that cause you pain now, they'll pass away. They'll be the former things. And so, just want to recap real quick. So we started by acknowledging that the problem of pain is a difficult topic. We went over the intellectual answers and how the existence of God is possible. It's compatible with the suffering that we see. We also went over the emotional answer and what God has done to respond to us. Personally, I needed both components. Given what I went through, I needed to know not only the intellectual side, but as well as the emotional side. And in the context of alternative explanations, personally, to this day, I find that this is the most satisfying answer. I hope this presentation helped a little bit. I know for some of you, this probably raised a lot more questions. I encourage you to keep thinking about it. Talk to it with a friend, and me as well as any of the other Crosstalk staff will be happy to talk about it too. But that's the end of my presentation. Oh, by the way, if you want some time to process, if you want to email me, that's fine too. You can just find me right there. But yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you, Kevin, for that talk. Just a quick announcement. I'm not sure if you were able to pick up a flyer on your way in, but we have open forum and special talks. So we have another special talk right here at the same time, 8 p.m. And the topic is going to be popular questions about God. So if you're a Cal student, please come and invite your friends too. And we've got plenty of flyers. And if you didn't get to sign in, we can keep you updated on future events like this as well. And so you can fill out a sheet of paper right outside at our registration table. And right now, we actually have refreshments for everyone outside. So please do stick around. And if you have any questions, Kevin, when he and I were sort of talking this through, I mean, we know that there's going to be a lot of questions here, but we don't have all night to really talk about this really intricate and pretty emotional topic. Kevin will be available outside by the refreshment table, so feel free to approach him, ask any questions, as well as me and any of the other Crosstalk staff here. So thank you for coming, and we hope to see you next week.